The photographer gasped before anyone else did. My veil slipped slightly as I stepped into the chapel, and that's when the whispers started. Not about the dress, not about the flowers, about my eye, dark purple, swollen, impossible to hide. I remember the way my fiancé adjusted his cufflinks when he saw my mother walk in. The way his lips curled upward, not concern, not shame, satisfaction. Then he leaned toward her, not quietly enough, and said, "It's so she learns." The room erupted in laughter, laughter on my wedding day. "Hi, my name is Kia P. Ren Ashvid. Yes, my parents were eccentric. Yes, I've heard every joke about it. I'm 28 years old, a marketing executive from Connecticut." And that morning, I was supposed to become Mrs. Everett Hale. Instead, I became something else. I stood there holding my bouquet, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on my bruised face while my mother stared at me, not in shock, in approval. That's when I understood something terrifying. The black eye wasn't just about control. It was a lesson, and I had one of my own to teach. But first, I needed them to think I was still the obedient bride. I didn't always look like a cautionary tale in white satin. 3 years ago, Everett Hale was charming in that polished East Coast generational wealth way. Private school grin, handwritten notes, old-fashioned values. My mother adored him immediately, said he was stable, solid, a man who leads. I mistook control for protection. The first crack appeared 6 months in. He didn't like my promotion, said long hours made me unavailable. When I laughed it off, he didn't. The silent treatment lasted 3 days. Then came the wardrobe comments. "That dress invites attention. You don't need to speak so loudly in meetings. It's unattractive when you argue." My mother would tilt her head sympathetically and say, "He just wants what's best for you. Calliope, men like him don't come around twice." By year 2, I had slowly reshaped myself around his preferences. Softer voice, lower heels, fewer friends. The night before the wedding, we argued in the hotel suite. I told him I wouldn't sign the prenup amendment. He'd flipped into the folder. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer. I remember the sharp smell of his cologne, and then darkness. When I woke up, he was sitting calmly in a chair, watching me as if waiting to see whether I'd finally learned. When I opened my eyes, the room was too quiet. Everett was still there. Jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly, watching me like I was an experiment that had finally produced results. "You fell," he said smoothly. "You got emotional." I touched my face. The pain answered before I could. "That's not what happened." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Caleb, we are hours away from a wedding attended by half of New Haven's board members. You're not going to humiliate me over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. I tried to stand the room tilted. He studied me, not gently, but firmly. "You will walk down that aisle," he whispered. "And you will smile." Then he added almost kindly, "It's for your own good." My phone buzzed on the dresser. My best friend, Mara. He picked it up before I could. "She doesn't need you today," he told. Her voicemail. By morning, my mother had already arrived at the hotel suite. She didn't gasp when she saw my face. She inspected it. Then she said, "Good. You'll remember this marriage is about respect." That's when something inside me stopped breaking and started calculating. The chapel was full. Crystal chandeliers, imported lies, a string quartet playing something soft and expensive, and me standing at the altar with a bruise blooming beneath designer makeup. Everett squeezed my hand when the officiant asked if anyone objected. His grip wasn't romantic. It was a warning. My mother sat in the front row, chin lifted, eyes sharp, watching to make sure I performed correctly. When the officiant reached the vows, Everett leaned closer and brushed his thumb along my cheek, right over the bruise. "So she learns," he repeated softly, smiling at my mother. Someone chuckled, then another. Then the room laughed. A bride injured and entertaining. I looked out at the sea of faces. investors, colleagues, relatives, all comfortably amused. That was the moment they expected me to cry or tremble or forgive. Instead, I reached for the microphone attached to the podium. The quartet faltered. "Before we continue," I said clearly, my voice steady despite the ache in my jaw, "I'd like to show everyone something." Everett's fingers tightened around mine. Too late. Behind us, the large projection screen flickered to life and the room went silent. The screen froze on a paused frame. Everett in the hotel suite, sleeves rolled, jaw tight. Mara had installed a discreet security app on my phone months ago just in case, she'd said after noticing how often he controlled conversations. It automatically backed up recordings to cloud storage, including last night. I pressed play, the chapel filled with Everett's voice. "You will walk down that aisle and you will smile." Gasps rippled through the pews, then the sound of the impact. A sharp, unmistakable crack. I didn't flinch. I'd already heard it a dozen times while planning this moment. I paused the video before the fall. I did fall, I told the room calmly, just not the way you were told. Everett stepped toward me, fury replacing charm. Turn that off. I tilted my head slightly, the bruise visible now under the lights. No, my mother rose halfway from her seat. "Kali, stop this." I finally looked at her. "You wanted me to learn," I said quietly. I did. Then I picked up the second envelope from the podium. And that's when Everett's confidence finally cracked. Everett's composure didn't shatter, it fractured subtly, the way porcelain does before it splits clean in half. "What is that?" he demanded, eyeing the envelope like it might explode. I faced the audience instead. "For months," I said evenly. I thought I was losing myself, that I was too emotional, too ambitious, too difficult. I slid the documents out slowly, deliberately, but I wasn't. The top page bore the letterhead of Hale and Crest Financial, Everett's family firm. I held it up. 3 weeks ago, I was asked to sign an amended prenup, one that transferred my existing assets into a joint holding trust. A murmur spread through the pews. What he didn't know, I continued, is that I'm very good at reading contracts and very good at tracing money. While Everett was busy correcting my tone and posture, I'd hired a forensic accountant. The documents detailed shell companies, undisclosed debt risk exposure tied to a pending investigation. "You needed my clean financial record," I said softly. "To stabilize your collapsing portfolio." Everett lunged for the papers. Security hired by my wedding planner ironically stepped in. I smiled at him. "Then this wedding," I said into the microphone, "was your bailout, and I just declined to sign." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical, precise, deadly. Everett looked around the room at the investors who had been smiling minutes earlier, at his father stiff in the third row, at the board member whispering urgently into his phone, "What she's doing is hysterical." He snapped, "She's unstable." The word hung in the air, unstable. I stepped down from the altar, heels echoing against marble. "No," I corrected calmly, "I'm informed." I turned slightly so the guests could see the final page projected behind me, a pending federal inquiry notice tied to one of his offshore entities. "I forwarded everything to the authorities this morning," I added. That wasn't entirely revenge. It was insurance. My mother rushed toward me, voice trembling. "You'll ruin your future." I met her gaze evenly. My future was never supposed to include silence. Everett's father stood. Abruptly, face drained of color. "Is this true?" he demanded. Everett didn't answer because he couldn't. The laughter from earlier had evaporated. Now the room wasn't amused. It was calculating just like I had been. And then Everett finally understood something. This wasn't a scene. It was an ending. Everett didn't chase me down the aisle. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He stood there perfectly dressed, perfectly exposed, while his empire quietly began to detach from him. I walked past the front pew where my mother sat frozen, her lipstick smile finally gone. "You embarrassed us," she whispered. I paused. No, I said gently. I ended it. Outside the chapel, the air felt different, lighter, almost unreal. Mara was waiting by the car, engine running. You okay? She asked. I touched the bruise beneath my eye. It'll fade. What won't fade is the look on Everett's face when he realized something crucial. The forensic accountant, real. The recordings, real. The investigation, very real. But the prenup amendment, I never intended to sign it anyway. The black eye was in a lesson. It was the evidence. 3 months later, Hale and Crest announced a restructuring. Everett resigned for personal reasons. My mother hasn't called. And me, I kept my name, Kalapi Ren Ashvid. Not because it's unusual, but because I learned something that day. If they expect obedience, give them consequences instead.